Stand at the edge of a cliff. Feel the wind tear at your clothes. Look down at the drop where rock meets sea. This is where Thomas Hardy stood in 1870, watching the woman he loved disappear into myth and memory. This is Beeny Cliff. Welcome to Alden Carrow's Poetry Podcast. I'm Alden Carrow, author of Cumbrian verse, Lakes to Fells in Poetry. Every week, I slow time down, we listen closely, we discover the poetry hiding in cliffs, in estuaries, in the space between what happened and what we remember. Today's journey, Hardy's haunting Beeny Cliff, where love and landscape collide, followed by my own poem, The Solway Firth, exploring the tidal border between England and Scotland. Then I'll reveal exactly how I research landscape poetry, the walks I take, the geological truths I hunt for beneath the beauty. And then finally, I want to hear from you. What guest poem should I read in a future episode? Email me at aldencarrow78@gmail.com. That's aldencarrow78@gmail.com. Let's begin where the land ends. For this episode, delving deeply into our theme of the dominance of fluidity and constant change, our guest poem is the haunting and deeply resonant Beeny Cliff by the great Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy is perhaps best known as a novelist of the Wessex countryside, but his poetry, particularly the collection written following the sudden death of his estranged wife Emma in 1912, contains some of the most profound meditations on landscape, memory, and the merciless passage of time in the English language. This sequence, known as Poems of 1912 to 13, represents a pilgrimage. Hardy returned to the rugged, weather-beaten coast of Cornwall, specifically to the places where he and Emma had first fallen in love decades earlier. Beeny Cliff is one of the monumental locations of that youthful romance. When we read this poem, we are asked to look at the immense, seemingly permanent structure of the cliff and contrast it with the wandering, chaotic, deeply fluid nature of the sea below. It is a poem about how the earth endures while our human lives, our passions, and our physical forms wash away like tide over slate. Hardy uses the landscape not merely as a backdrop, but as a primary character, an enduring geological witness to the frail and temporary nature of human connection. The cliff remains rigid, while everything around it, the water, the weather, and indeed Hardy's own life, is entirely dominated by fluidity and constant change. As you listen, I want you to picture that wild Atlantic coast, the stark drop of the rocks, and the rhythmic, unceasing pulse of the ocean below, carving away at the stone just as time carves away at our most cherished memories. This is a space where the solid meets the liquid, where the past tries in vain to anchor itself against the sweeping currents of the present. Beeny Cliff by Thomas Hardy. Oh, the opal and the sapphire of that wandering western sea, and the woman riding high above with bright hair flapping free. The woman whom I love so, and who loyally loved me. The pale muse planed below us, and the waves seemed far away, in a nether sky engrossed in saying their ceaseless babbling say, as we laughed light-heartedly aloft on that clear sun-marched day. A little cloud then cloaked us, and there flew an irised rain, and the Atlantic dyed its levels with a subtle purplish stain. And on the blind bare hideous cliff the sun shone back again. And will he pale the presence of that woman in the gloom? And will he never once recall the woman riding doom? And will he never once recall the woman riding doom? Nay, one there is to whom these things that brinks enjoy and doom will ever be a reality to me and to me alone. But the woman whom I love so and who loyally loved me is now but a ghost, a spirit, who will never again ride free. Over the cliff, the bare hideous cliff, by that wandering western sea. The emotional architecture of Beeny Cliff is built entirely upon the friction between permanence and fluidity. Right from the very first line, Hardy immerses the reader in the shifting, volatile nature of water. Oh, the opal and the sapphire of that wandering western sea. Look at the use of colour here. Opal and sapphire are precious stones, typically hard, static and unyielding, yet Hardy applies them to the ocean, giving the water a multifaceted, luminescent quality that changes depending on the light. The sea is wandering, a word that implies a lack of fixed direction, a restless, untethered energy that perfectly encapsulates the theme of constant change. Hardy contrasts this deeply fluid, wandering sea with the figure of Emma, the woman riding high above with bright hair flapping free. In his memory, she is vibrantly alive, moving, dynamic, almost as fluid as the wind and the water. But as the poem progresses, the reality of time's passage begins to assert itself. The landscape undergoes subtle, fluid shifts in weather and light. A little cloud then cloaked us, and there flew an irised rain, and the Atlantic dyed its levels with a subtle purplish stain. Here, the environment is not a static painting, it's a living, breathing, constantly altering organism. The rain is irised, coloured like a rainbow, fleeting and transient. The ocean changes from opal and sapphire to a purplish stain. This fluidity of the landscape mirrors the fluidity of human emotion and the uncontrollable shifts in our destinies. We cannot hold on to the light, just as we cannot hold on to love or life. Then Hardy turns his gaze to the cliff itself. He calls it the blind, bare, hideous cliff. Why hideous? Because it endures. In its massive, unfeeling geological permanence, the cliff mocks the fragile, temporary nature of human existence. The cliff does not care that Emma is gone. It does not mourn. It simply stands blind and bare, allowing the sun to shine back upon it as if nothing has changed. Yet even this permanence is an illusion. We know, and Hardy intuitively knew, that the wandering western sea is constantly eating away at that stone. The babbling waves are slowly, over millennia, pulling the cliff down into the water. Ultimately, fluidity wins. The ocean reclaims the land, just as death and time reclaim the living. Emma is reduced to a ghost, a spirit who will never ride free over that cliff. The tragedy of the poem lies in the speaker's realization that he is left alone with a landscape that outlives him, a terrain shaped by ceaseless, fluid motion that cares nothing for the grief of a solitary human heart. Memory, Hardy suggests, is much like that ocean, a vast, deep, constantly shifting tide that washes over the solid ground of our present reality, threatening to pull us under. We build cliffs in our minds, structures of memory we hope will last forever. But the dominant force of the universe is not solid rock. It is the fluid, the transient, and the ever-changing tide. Moving from the towering cliffs of Cornwall, I want to take us north to a landscape that operates entirely differently, but is equally dominated by the forces of water and relentless change. The poem I've chosen to share with you today is one of my own, titled The Solway Firth, taken from my collection, Cumbria in Verse, Lakes to Fells in Poetry. The Solway Firth forms part of the border between England and Scotland. Unlike the dramatic vertical drops of Beeny Cliff, the Solway is defined by its extreme horizontal flatness. It is a massive funnel-shaped estuary, a place of shifting sandbanks, deep mud, and some of the most powerful tides in the British Isles. When you stand on the edge of the Solway, you're looking at a landscape that refuses to stay still. It is entirely dominated by fluidity. The channels move from year to year. What was safe ground yesterday might be a deep, treacherous current tomorrow. It's a place where human traces are rapidly erased, swallowed by the silt and the salt. Writing about the Solway is an exercise in trying to capture something that is inherently incapturable, a geography that writes its own maps twice a day. This poem attempts to translate the sheer physical force of that environment, the quiet menace of its tidal speed, and the deceptive emptiness of its vast horizons. The Solway Firth. The funnel narrows where the Solway enters, a horizontal push of grey against the silt. The water does not rise so much as arrive, a solitary pulse that levels the channel's neck and shoves the river back into the land. Miles of quartz and fine-grained light unfold as the ebb drags its burden south. The floor is a trap for what the current brings, a slow accretion of anoxic mud and shell, levelled by a gradient the eye cannot perceive. Fixed wooden stakes lean where the deeps once swung, marking a channel that ghosted years ago. Tyre tracks cross the wath before the light fails, etched into ripples that the next flood will take, behind the limestone blocks and rusted seawall. The land heaves up, unburdening from the ice, while the water gnaws a red sandstone lip. One bank is eaten, the other fed by drift. The current hunts through a decade's arc, scouring new reach into the salt marsh grip. The horizon dissolves where the air grows thick, hiding the speed of the tide in a flat grey run. It gathers without a crest to break the surge, swallowing the distance, the sand, the safe way home. In the Solway Firth, I wanted to strip away the romanticised notions of the coast and focus entirely on the mechanics of fluidity, the brute physical reality of a landscape governed by water. The opening lines, the funnel narrows where the salt weight enters, a horizontal push of grey against the silt, immediately establish the geography and the physics of the place. The Solway is a funnel, and that shape compresses the incoming tide, turning it from a gentle rise into a violent horizontal force. I use the term salt weight because the tide here does not feel like mere water. It feels heavy, a massive geological entity muscling its way into the estuary. The water does not rise so much as arrive. It's a crucial distinction. On a traditional beach, the tide slowly creeps up the sand. On the Solway, because of the extreme flatness, the water comes in as a sudden presence, a solitary pulse or tidal bore that physically shoves the descending rivers backward. The second stanza moves to the aftermath of the tide, the ebb that drags its burden south. Here we see the materials left behind, miles of quartz and fine-grained light, contrasting with the slow accretion of anoxic mud and shell. The Solway is a place of deep contradictions. On the surface, the wet sand reflects the sky, creating a beautiful, blinding light. But just beneath that surface lies the anoxic mud, dark, oxygen-starved, smelling of decay and ancient organic matter. It's a landscape that is constantly burying its own history. The gradient is so shallow that the eye cannot perceive it, playing a trick on human perception, making us believe we are safe on solid ground, when we're actually standing in the middle of an ocean waiting to return. In the third stanza, we introduce human elements, but only to highlight their futility. Fixed wooden stakes lean where the deeps once swung. These stakes, perhaps remnants of historic half-net fishing, were placed with the assumption that the deep water would always be there. But the channels in the Solway are nomadic. They migrate over the years, leaving these human markers stranded in the mud, guarding a ghost river. Even the more recent tyre tracks cross the wath, the wath being the Old Norse word for a ford across the sands, are entirely transient. They are etched into the ripples only until the next flood tide wipes the slate clean. It's a profound reminder of the dominance of fluidity over our attempts at permanence. The fourth stanza pulls back to a deep time perspective. The land heaves up, unburdening from the ice. This refers to isostatic rebound, the incredibly slow rising of the Earth's crust since the glaciers melted. So, while the water is rapidly gnawing at the red sandstone lip, the land itself is also in motion, albeit imperceptibly. Everything is moving. One bank is eaten, the other fed by drift, captures the endless zero-sum game of erosion and deposition. The water is a hunter, scouring new reach into the salt marsh grip. Finally, the poem closes on the sensory deprivation and danger of the Firth. The horizon dissolves where the air grows thick, hiding the speed of the tide in a flat grey run. Because there are no vertical reference points, you cannot judge distance or speed accurately. The tide does not come in with crashing waves, it gathers without a crest. A silent, incredibly fast sheet of water that swallows the safe way home. The Solway Firth is a masterclass in the terrifying beauty of fluidity, a place where the solid world is constantly unmade and remade by the unyielding rhythms of the sea. For our discussion this week, I want to spend this part of the podcast discussing the extensive research that went into conceptualising the Solway Firth, and how deeply I had to immerse myself in the physical, spatial and temporal mechanics of this environment to accurately capture its spirit. Writing poetry about a landscape like the Solway cannot simply rely on passing visual impressions. It requires an almost scientific understanding of the primary constraints and physical forces that shape the place. When I began my research, I focused on the high-energy tidal regime. The Solway Firth is essentially a shallow, funnel-shaped basin. This funnel geometry is critical because it creates an immense tidal compression. During spring tides, the water range can reach approximately 8.4 metres or about 27.5 feet. This is an astounding volume of water trying to force its way into a narrowing gap. This compression manifests as powerful flood currents and, occasionally, as a tidal bore, a solitary wave up to 1.5 metres high that travels visibly upstream into rivers like the Nith and the Eden. Learning about this force changed how I drafted the poem. I stopped writing about the water rising and started writing about it pushing and arriving. I also studied the concept of asymmetrical sedimentation. The flood tide rushing inward moves at a higher velocity than the retreating ebb tide. This creates a natural sediment trap. The Firth is constantly pulling vast quantities of sand and silt from the Irish Sea and dropping it into the inner basin, creating the endless mudflats and sandbanks. Concurrently, hydraulic wave erosion from southwesterly winds pounds the outer coastal cliffs, like the St. Bees Head, forcing air into rock cracks and scouring the edges of the salt marshes. And beneath all this rapid tidal chaos, there is the slow, deep time movement of post-glacial rebound. The Earth's crust here is literally still rising, recovering from the immense weight of Ice Age glaciers. It's a landscape defined by containment and shallow depth. The basin rarely exceeds 20 to 50 metres in depth, meaning all that immense tidal energy has nowhere to go but sideways, expressing itself as horizontal speed of up to 4 knots rather than vertical volume. This led me to explore how, or even if, human beings register in such an overwhelming shifting space. The Solway registers human presence primarily through futile attempts at containment and navigation. You see linear coastal infrastructure, man-made seawalls, embankments and heavy rock armour, trying to draw a fixed line in an unfixed world. There are high visibility navigational markers, steel towers and the beautiful white painted masonry of the Southern Ness Lighthouse, desperate attempts to provide fixed points in a maritime void. At low tide, the true vulnerability of our history is revealed. You see the submerged and shoreline remnants, the ruined sandstone piers of the old Solway Viaduct, and the haunting fixed wooden stakes once used for ancient half-net fishing or historic fish traps now jutting pointlessly from the shifting sands. On the landward salt marshes, known locally as mercies, you find engineered drainage networks, grids of man-made channels or grips carved into the mud to allow livestock grazing. Further along the coast, there are the massive, looming footprints of material extraction, like the decommissioned Chapel Cross Power Station and dark coastal colliery spoil heaps, but perhaps the most poetic human traces are the transient vehicular rhythms. During the brief low-tide windows, people still cross the shifting sandbanks following established wath or ford routes, their tyre tracks and footsteps leaving a temporary human scar that the next tide will flawlessly erase. To make the poem tactile, I had to deeply understand the material specifics of the Firth. The primary surface is composed of Holocene fine sands, light grey quartz that forms mobile banks and ripples, but step into a lower energy zone, and the ground gives way to anoxic mud and silt, dark, oxygen-depleted, and dangerously lacking in structural rigidity. The edges of the Firth are defined by the Triassic red St. Bees sandstone of the cliffs, with its distinct granular texture and horizontal bedding planes, contrasting sharply with the vegetation of the upper shoreline. Here, salt marsh plants like common salt marsh grass, sea aster and glasswort create a dense, springy, grey-green mat of organic matter. Against this natural, shifting canvas, you find the weathered concrete and quarried limestone of human sea defences, interspersed with intermittent shell shingle, long, linear ridges of broken cockle and mussel shells known as cheniers. And always there is the brackish water interface, turbulent and brown with suspended silt in the inner channels, shifting to a clearer saline blue-green as you look out towards the Irish Sea. Understanding the scale and spatial behaviour of the Solway was perhaps the most challenging aspect to translate into verse. The spatial behaviour here is defined by extreme horizontal expansion and an almost total absence of vertical obstruction. The intertidal zone stretches for kilometres at a gradient so incredibly shallow it appears perfectly flat to the human eye. When the tide recedes, the room of the Firth undergoes a massive volumetric expansion, exposing up to 120 square kilometres of raw, wet seabed. Because there are no high-altitude features, you experience unobstructed visibility. You can see 20 to 40 kilometres across to the opposite shore, limited only by the curvature of the earth or the atmospheric haze. Yet within this vast visible arena, there is dynamic channel movement. The deep water channels physically migrate over months and years, meaning the concept of stable ground is an illusion. Space here is funnel-shaped, forcing two-dimensional transit. Everything moves horizontally. There's nowhere to climb, nowhere to escape the water's advance. Finally, to truly grasp the Solway, I had to align myself with its temporal rhythms. Time operates differently here. It's governed by a complete physical transformation of the landscape twice every 24 hours. The Firth shifts from a submerged aquatic realm to a terrestrial desert of sand in a relentless heartbeat. Time is punctuated by the pulsed inundation of the tidal bore, a sudden violent event that alters the flow direction in minutes. Overlaid on this daily rhythm is the seasonal avian flux. In winter, the acoustic and biological reality of the Firth changes dramatically as thousands of migratory geese and waders descend upon the mudflats, an annual pulse of life that vanishes again in the spring. There is the intermittent rhythm of ford accessibility, narrow time windows where the cross-estuary routes are traversable, followed by hours of total interruption. And zooming out further, there is the decadal channel migration, the slow multi-year swing of the rivers that continuously redefines the map itself. And always, there is meteorological interference, high-pressure systems and gale-force winds that can unpredictably accelerate or delay the tides, reminding us that no matter how carefully we measure the rhythms of this fluid world, it remains fundamentally untamable, forever slipping through our fingers, forever changing its course. Now that you've listened to a guest poem, one of my poems, and I've discussed the research behind my poem, The Solway Firth, taken from my latest book, Cumbrian Verse Lakes to Fells in Poetry, which is available at Amazon, I'd love to hear from you. If there's a poem you'd like me to feature as a guest poem in a future episode, please email me at aldencarrow78@gmail.com. That's aldencarrow78@gmail.com. It could be a classic, something modern, or even a personal favourite that means a lot to you. This way, the podcast becomes a shared journey. So thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, may you find the poetry in the everyday, and I look forward to speaking to you again on Wednesday.